Sarah Thompson always believed she understood her marriage, but lately she had begun to sense something drifting beneath the surface. Something quiet but powerful, like a soft current pulling them in opposite directions. She and her husband Daniel lived in a peaceful Oregon neighborhood where mornings smelled like pine and evenings hummed with distant traffic. But even the calm around them couldn't hide what she felt growing inside their home. She noticed it in small moments when Daniel paused before answering her, when he smiled, but his eyes didn't fully follow, when his hand brushed hers out of habit rather than connection. Their life still functioned, still looked stable from the outside. Yet Sarah felt an invisible distance forming, a gap she didn't know how to cross because Daniel hadn't given her any explanation. He never raised his voice, never acted cold, never blamed her. Instead, he carried a softness that seemed heavier every day, a longing wrapped in silence. She couldn't name it, but she could feel it every time she caught him watching her with that quiet, almost hopeful expression, as if waiting for something he wasn't sure he should ask for. For weeks, Sarah tried to ignore it, telling herself marriages went through quiet seasons. That routine could numb even the warmest hearts, that everything would eventually settle. But the truth was harder to face. She was afraid of what Daniel might say if she asked him directly. She feared he wanted something she wasn't ready for, something that might change everything. So she carried on, cooking dinners that felt too silent, going on walks where their steps matched but their thoughts didn't, and lying in bed beside him with questions stretching between them like unspoken shadows. Daniel, however, had reached a point where silence no longer helped him. Something inside him had been building for months, a wish that started as a small ache and grew each time he looked at Sarah and wondered if she still felt the same depth of partnership they once shared. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was the quiet realization that they were drifting not because of anger but because of unspoken fears. He didn't want to push her or risk hurting her. So he waited, hoping the right moment would come. That moment arrived on a rainy evening in early October. The sky had turned a deep gray and the wind carried a cold bite, signaling the first hint of winter. Sarah sat curled up on the couch, reading a magazine she wasn't really paying attention to, while Daniel stood near the window, staring at the rain rolling down the glass. The room felt warm, yet the silence between them felt cooler than the weather outside. Sarah looked up and caught Daniel watching her again, but this time his expression was different, less hesitant. She sat straighter, sensing a shift she wasn't ready for. Daniel stepped away from the window and sat beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the steady pressure of his presence. When he reached for her hand, his touch was gentle, but carried a tremble she had never felt before. "Sarah," he said, his voice low and steady despite the tension in his shoulders. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you." That sentence alone made her pulse quicken. She already knew this wasn't a small confession or a simple thought. This was the moment she had been sensing for months. The moment she had tried to avoid by pretending everything was fine. The steady rhythm of rain tapping the windows filled the silence as Daniel searched for the right words. Sarah braced herself, her heart tightening. She could feel that whatever he was about to say mattered deeply to him, and if it mattered to him, it would matter to her. He took a breath, clearing the weight in his chest, and then he finally spoke. The words came softly, not rushed, not dramatic, but sincere in a way that made Sarah's stomach twist. He told her he had a wish, one he had carried quietly because he didn't want her to feel pressured or overwhelmed, one that came from wanting their marriage to feel alive again, not just stable. She didn't interrupt him, didn't look away, even when the truth made her eyes warm. She had expected something else, a confession, a complaint, maybe even a fear that he wanted something impossible. But his wish was something entirely different, something tender and vulnerable. It wasn't about changing their life, but about reconnecting it. The moment he finished speaking, Sarah felt her breath catch. The simplicity and honesty of his wish shook her more than any dramatic revelation could have. She looked at him, really looked at him, and realized how long he had been carrying this in silence, hoping she would somehow understand without him having to say it. She felt a rush of guilt for not noticing sooner and a rush of relief that he trusted her enough to finally share it. She wanted to answer him right then, to tell him how much she still cared, how much she wanted to fix the distance forming between them, how much she wanted them to find their way back. But before she could speak, before she could give him the reassurance she knew he needed, the quiet room was interrupted by an unexpected sound, a knock on the front door that echoed through the house. It startled both of them, snapping the delicate moment in half. Sarah and Daniel exchanged a quick, uncertain glance. No one ever visited them on weeknights, especially not in the middle of a storm. The knock came again, heavier this time, as if whoever stood outside needed something urgent. Sarah rose slowly, her heart still tangled in the words Daniel had spoken, unsure if she was ready to face whatever waited beyond the door. And with her hand on the doorknob, she felt a strange, sudden certainty. Their night and their marriage was about to change in ways neither of them expected. Daniel's words hung in the air, heavy with honesty and trembling with emotion, as Sarah tried to absorb what he had just shared. The way he looked at her, eyes searching, lips barely moving, made her feel like she was seeing him for the first time in years. He wasn't asking for a gift or for forgiveness for a mistake or for anything dramatic. He was asking for something far more intimate and fragile, a chance to rebuild the connection that had always been the heart of their marriage. "I want us back," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, but this time firmer, more certain. "I want the version of us that existed before we let routine and worry pull us apart. I want the late-night talks, the quiet laughs, the way we trusted each other without thinking twice. I want to choose you, Sarah, the way I did when we first fell in love." Sarah felt the words echo through her chest. She had been living alongside Daniel for years, sharing a life that looked perfect on the surface. Yet she hadn't realized how much distance had grown between them, how much warmth had faded into habit. Now, hearing him admit his longing, she felt a stir of hope that she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. For a moment, Sarah didn't speak. She simply looked at him, noticing every detail, the faint worry lines that had deepened over the past year, the way his hands rested lightly on the table as if steadying himself, the quiet vulnerability that shone through in a way he rarely allowed anyone to see. It struck her how brave he was to say the words aloud, and how much it reminded her of the man she had fallen in love with, the one who had once made the ordinary feel extraordinary. A sudden warmth spread through her chest, a mix of relief, longing, and tenderness. She realized she had been waiting for this honesty, even if she hadn't known it, waiting for him to trust her with the truth of his heart, her own feelings, which she had buried beneath the weight of daily life, now rose to meet his. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, she felt their hearts aligned in a shared rhythm. "I miss you, too," she whispered, and the sound of her voice seemed to surprise both of them, not in a judgmental or critical way, but like a release, as though saying the words aloud could let them breathe again. Daniel's eyes softened immediately, relief flooding his features, and he shifted closer to her on the couch, his shoulder brushing hers. They both stayed still for a moment, letting the silence stretch between them, but it was no longer heavy. It felt full, alive, as though the truth had filled a space that routine had left empty. Daniel's hand reached for hers again, and this time it wasn't trembling. It was steady, deliberate, and it carried a sense of promise, a quiet commitment that went beyond what either of them had spoken. Sarah gripped his hand back, her heart beating faster, aware of the intimacy of the moment without needing words to explain it. But just as the room seemed to settle into this tender connection, a sudden interruption broke the moment, a sharp knock on the front door that echoed against the walls of their quiet home. Both Sarah and Daniel stiffened. It was late, and rain had begun to fall harder, tapping insistently against the windows. Visitors were rare at this hour, especially in a storm, and the sound carried a sense of urgency that neither of them could ignore. Daniel's brow furrowed, his hand still holding Sarah's, but the tension returned in an instant. Sarah's heart raced. Part of her wanted to ignore it and remain in this fragile bubble of reconnection. But another part knew life rarely allowed moments of healing to exist uninterrupted. She rose cautiously, her hands still in Daniel's as she walked toward the door, and they exchanged a quick, questioning glance. Daniel gave a small, encouraging nod, silently telling her it was okay to open the door, even though neither of them knew who or what awaited them outside. When Sarah pulled the door open, a figure appeared, soaked by the rain and shivering from the chill. It was Claire, Daniel's younger sister, carrying a small suitcase and looking smaller than usual under the gray sky. Her eyes were red, her voice trembling as she muttered, "I didn't know where else to go." Sarah instinctively stepped aside, letting her in, while Daniel grabbed a towel from the nearby rack and started drying Claire's hair and shoulders. The warmth of the house immediately met her, and a mixture of relief and confusion crossed her face as she assessed the situation. Claire had always been strong, independent, and capable of handling anything life threw at her, so seeing her so vulnerable stirred both Daniel and Sarah deeply. They guided her to the living room, wrapped her in blankets, and handed her hot tea, all while the storm continued outside. As Claire began to explain her sudden heartbreak and why she needed a place to stay, Sarah noticed the subtle glances Daniel gave her. It was clear he had been worrying about his sister's safety, while also managing the emotional weight of their own conversation earlier. Watching him care so deeply for someone else reminded Sarah why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. She felt a surge of admiration and tenderness that mingled with the love she was just beginning to admit aloud. Claire's presence was unexpected, yet it brought with it a subtle clarity. Through the way Daniel interacted with his sister, gently, patiently, and compassionately, Sarah understood the depth of his longing for connection, for the family he loved, and for the marriage he cherished. Claire, noticing the tension between Sarah and Daniel, gave a small, knowing look as if she understood that something important was unfolding without words. Sarah realized that Daniel's wish wasn't only for them. It reflected the values he held close, the love he carried quietly, and the life he hoped to rebuild. By the time Claire finished sharing her story, the rain had softened to a light drizzle. The house, now warm and bright with lamps and the quiet hum of conversation, felt like a shelter, not just from the storm outside, but from the uncertainty that had built up in their marriage. Sarah glanced at Daniel again, noticing how the lines of worry on his face had softened, and she felt her heart open just a little more. She understood now that this night, complicated and unexpected, was exactly what they needed to begin healing. Their connection, fragile but real, had been given a chance, not just by words, but by the presence of love, vulnerability, and family. And deep down, Sarah knew the night wasn't over. Their story was only beginning, and the choice she would make next could change everything. The night grew darker outside as rain continued to drizzle softly against the windows. But inside, Sarah and Daniel's small house buzzed with a quiet tension. Claire, Daniel's younger sister, sat on the couch wrapped in a blanket, her suitcase pushed to the corner, looking exhausted and uncertain. She had arrived without warning, soaked from the storm, and the vulnerability in her eyes pulled both Daniel and Sarah into a new rhythm of care and concern. As she explained her sudden breakup, the heartbreak that had driven her to seek refuge in their home became clear, and the room filled with empathy and soft murmurs of reassurance. Daniel stayed close, offering towels, making tea, and listening intently as Claire described her confusion and pain. Sarah watched him, her heart swelling in admiration and warmth. The man who had quietly carried a longing in their marriage was now revealing another side of himself, gentle, steady, patient, and caring for someone else with an ease that reminded her of why she had fallen in love with him in the first place. She realized that his capacity to love extended beyond just their marriage, and that made her feel safer, more connected, and even more willing to respond to the wish he had shared earlier. Claire's presence brought a strange mix of chaos and clarity. She hadn't planned to disrupt their evening, yet she had, and it forced Sarah and Daniel to confront feelings and truths that had been simmering beneath the surface. As the three of them settled into the living room, Sarah noticed how Daniel's focus shifted naturally between his sister and her. He was protective without being overbearing, attentive without losing himself, and the way he managed both responsibilities quietly impressed her. It made her see him differently, strong yet sensitive, confident yet vulnerable. Sarah's mind wandered back to the words he had whispered earlier, the wish he had carried silently, and she realized that those words were not just about longing for connection. They were about the life they could rebuild together, a life that included honesty, care, and shared responsibility. The soft glow of the lamps in the room, the gentle clink of the teacups, and the rhythm of their combined breathing created a moment of intimacy she hadn't felt in a long time, and she felt a quiet hope rising in her chest. As Claire talked, Sarah began to understand her role in this unexpected night. She could choose to retreat into her own emotions, letting the moment slip, or she could step forward and be part of the healing, not just for Claire, but for Daniel and herself. Sarah decided to stay present, listening to Claire's story and offering her support, while Daniel attended to his sister's needs. She noticed small details, the way Claire's shoulders slumped when she thought no one was watching, the fleeting relief in her eyes when Daniel handed her a warm towel, and the way Daniel's hand hovered near hers, even when helping his sister, as if checking she was still there with him. The subtle gestures between Sarah and Daniel reminded her that their connection was alive, that it had never truly disappeared, and that the words he had spoken earlier were more than just wishes. They were a call to action, an invitation to rebuild what they had allowed to fade. Throughout the evening, Sarah began to feel a new kind of clarity. Claire's sudden arrival had introduced unpredictability, yet it had also made the space for honesty and vulnerability that neither she nor Daniel could have created alone. She saw how Daniel's care for his sister mirrored the patience and gentleness he wanted to bring back into their marriage. The more she watched, the more Sarah realized that saying yes to his wish didn't have to be a dramatic or immediate event. It could be a series of small choices, a commitment to respond to love with love, and to rebuild trust and intimacy step by step. She also understood that life's interruptions, the storm, Claire's heartbreak, the knock on the door, were part of the process, part of the story they were writing together. The storm outside mirrored the turbulence in their hearts, and yet the warmth and light inside the house reflected the possibility of healing and reconnection. Sarah caught Daniel's eyes across the room, and for a moment, the noise of Claire's trembling voice and the ticking of the clock faded. In that instant, unspoken promises passed between them. She saw gratitude, longing, and a quiet courage in him that made her chest tighten with emotion. She realized that their marriage had never been about perfection. It had always been about choices, about moments of vulnerability and connection, about being willing to say yes to love even when it was complicated. Claire, sensing the subtle exchange, gave a small, knowing smile, as if silently encouraging them to take the step they had been avoiding. Sarah felt the weight of the night, the storm, the surprises, the confessions, and understood that everything leading up to this moment had prepared them for a new beginning. By the time Claire had settled with a cup of tea and a soft blanket, the house felt quieter, not because the storm had ended, but because something had shifted inside. Daniel and Sarah sat together, closer than before, their hands brushing, their glances lingering, and the tension that had shadowed their marriage for months seemed to soften. Sarah realized that the night had offered more than just shelter for Claire. It had offered a mirror for their own lives, a chance to see themselves honestly, and an opportunity to answer the wish Daniel had spoken earlier. They didn't need a dramatic declaration, only the courage to meet each other where they were, to step into vulnerability, and to take the first step toward rebuilding their love. And as the rain faded into a gentle drizzle, Sarah understood that tonight was not an ending or a resolution. It was the beginning of a journey, one that could finally bring them back to each other, one careful, loving choice at a time. The house was quiet now. The storm outside reduced to a soft drizzle, and Claire had finally gone to bed, leaving Sarah and Daniel alone in the warm glow of the living room. The events of the evening, the knock on the door, Claire's sudden heartbreak, and the gentle chaos she had brought had stirred something in both of them, making the air feel heavier and yet more open than it had in months. Sarah could feel the tension in her chest, a mixture of hope, nervousness, and anticipation. She looked at Daniel, sitting across from her on the couch, and noticed the softness in his eyes, the way his hands rested lightly on his knees, and the faint tremor in his shoulders that betrayed both relief and vulnerability. He had shared his wish, faced the storm of his emotions, and yet waited for her to respond. Sarah realized the moment for a choice had arrived. It wasn't just about words, it was about action, about stepping into the space of their marriage that had grown quiet and rebuilding it from the inside out.